Hi, this is Pastor Dan with Common Ground. You ever heard of the sin of Achan in the Bible? Maybe you've heard of the story of Jericho. Jericho was a city in ancient Israel, a huge fortified city with large walls going all the way around it, and God miraculously delivered this city into the hands of ancient Israel. You can read all about that story in the book of Joshua in the Bible, chapter 6. But God told Israel that Jericho was to be set apart to him. They would not be able to enjoy the spoils of war, not this time. Everything that was in Jericho would be destroyed completely, except for a few items, such as silver and gold items, were brought into the Lord's treasury. So God delivered the city into Israel's hands, and there was a man named Achan who took some of what belonged to God. He took the things that were set apart to God, and he hid them in his tent. Now God became very angry with Israel and did not go before them in their next battle. This was a very small battle. Israel should have easily won, but they lost. And Joshua, who was the commander of Israel at the time, lamented and cried out to God, "Why did we lose? You said you would go before us. You had promised this. So what's going on?" And so God identified the sin of Israel, specifically the sin of Achan. And he identified actually Achan and his family as the ones who committed this sin also. And Achan and his family were put to death. Now, I realize this is very different culture from what we are in today, but it is a part of what God's testimony is in the past. So giving something completely to the Lord means that it becomes holy. It's reserved for God's use and thus forbidden for man to consume or use it. And what is given to the Lord is generally surrendered, or was generally surrendered, to the priests. And if it was flammable, it would be burnt up or destroyed. Other things that were not flammable would be brought into the Lord's treasury. Now, there were some things in ancient Israel which always were dedicated to God or set apart to God. For instance, all the first fruits of everything were set apart to God, including the first fruits of the crops that would come up each year. The firstborn of the flocks and the herds were given to God. The firstborn of families were given to God as well. However, the firstborn was to be redeemed. This means that something was to be destroyed or given in its place. Usually that would involve an animal sacrifice. But God made means so that even the poorest of the poor could set apart something unto him and would have something that could be redeemed. So Achan took what belonged to the Lord and he hid it. He did not fear God. He resisted God. He literally stole from God. Today, people still commit the sin of Achan, and they are going to suffer the same fate as Achan. The gospel of Jesus Christ declares to us how this is, because everything is fulfilled through Jesus Christ. The scriptures state that Jesus Christ purchased all people for God by shedding his blood upon the cross. Each of us now belongs to God. We are his own possession. We are set apart for him, just like Jericho was set apart. And what happens to that which is set apart to God? Well, it's either destroyed, right? Or it's brought into the treasury of the Lord. But you see, Christ also redeemed us. He literally was destroyed or died in our place. And what is even more, by Christ's death we are forgiven, and meaning that we are reconciled to God. While we were enemies of God because of our sin nature, we were actually made or reconciled with him. That relationship is reconciled. So let me say this again. We belong to God. We were purchased by Jesus Christ for God. You and I. It does not matter the most broken, the most vile, the most lost person, the most blind person, still belongs to God because we were purchased for him by Jesus Christ. Like Achan, some will try and take what is God's and hide it. What is God's? We are God's. Some will not fear God, and they will resist him. They will try to hide from God in some way or another and take their own life in their own hands and live how they want to, as though they are their own. Why is it that some trample upon the gift of God to us? And they try instead to keep their own life, living according to their own desires, their own mindsets. Why is it some will not submit to God as his own? Well, like Achan, they do not fear God. Jesus stated that anyone who does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. The cross is an instrument of death. Christ is literally saying we must die to self and follow him. What does dying to self mean? That means letting go of the old ways of life, letting go of the carnal nature of our own mindsets, seeing through God's eyes, surrendering to him. Christ continued and he said, whoever finds his life will lose it. However, whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So if we take our life in our own hands like Achan, and we are unwilling to die to self, we are unwilling to fear God, to surrender to him, to leave behind those carnal mindsets and worldly ways of living, then we will not know eternal life, which God gives. However, the opposite is true, that if we are willing to die to all that old stuff, if we're willing to follow Christ, we will have life from God. The Bible calls this eternal life. I hope you have surrendered to God. I hope you have not trampled on his gift of salvation, and that you understand that you belong to God, and it's necessary then to submit to him, to fear him. Well, next week we're going to learn another lesson that we can glean from the story of Achan. So I look forward to sharing with you next week.